and subscribe.
In July, Payne flew to Canada. At a motel in Montreal, he met a man sent by the mafia. On the twins' behalf, he purchased £20,000 of stolen bearer bonds at a quarter of face value, brought them to Paris, then helped the twins dispose of them in England. The twins pocketed 3/4 of the take. The traffic in American securities began. It appealed naturally to Ronnie, who had the instincts of a genuine tycoon, the love of power, the feeling for expansion, the monomaniac's obsession with himself. For him, reality and fantasy were one, so that the chance of dealing with the mafia and entering the League of International big-time racketeers seemed quite inevitable. Soon he would have his private plane, his bank accounts in Switzerland, his foreign interests, his house like Billy Hill's in southern Spain. Like all of Ronnie's dreams, there was some truth in this. No other English racketeers had ever reached such heights. Like royalty, the twins could give their name to any scheme, knowing it would bring results. Other men would do the work, others supply the brains. On the strength of the Kray name, a succession of conmen, gunmen, smugglers, fixers, forgers, and international moneymen could begin to operate round the world. All that was required of the twins, it seemed, was to make sure that everybody feared them. Reggie and Francis spent their honeymoon in Athens. Francis disliked the food. Reggie could see nothing in the city. There was no one to talk to, and the high spot of the holiday came when some sailors invited them aboard a visiting American warship for the evening. Several nights running, Reggie got drunk. Even so, Reggie kept up his dream of living the good life with Francis. After the honeymoon, he rented an expensive furnished flat off Lancaster Gate, but they had no real friends there, no interest in theaters, films, the life of the city. Reggie was out a lot. Francis was lonely and cut off. Reggie drank. The argument started. Finally, they agreed that they both wanted to live back in the East End where their real life lay. Reggie found a flat in Cedar Court, directly below Ronnie's. Frequently, the noise of Ronnie's parties kept Francis awake at night. She was never invited, but Reggie often went, and in the early morning she would hear the sound of Ronnie's boys going down the stairs. When Reggie finally came home, he was often bitter with her. Later he apologized. She blamed Ronnie and began to think he really hated her. She hardly ever saw him, but often heard him shouting in the night. Soon she refused to speak his name. For her, Ronnie became the other one. Occasionally they passed each other on the stairs. The other one would always be polite, smiling at her behind his spectacles. "Hello Francis, my dear. And how are you? Enjoying yourself in the family?" Francis had never understood how joyless and oppressive the twins' private world could be. While he was courting her, Reggie had always been escaping from it. On their own, he could seem gay and almost childlike. At Cedar Court there was little gaiety. There were still nights out with her husband to meet visiting celebrities. She dined with Judy Garland and George Raft, but rarely spoke at such occasions unless spoken to. Her days were spent alone at Cedar Court, her evenings usually at clubs or parties where the guests were always criminals, the talk invariably of crime. A few of the regulars used her. Mad Teddy Smith could make her laugh and she liked talking to him. The rest were not her type. Everything was done for her. This was one way Reggie could still show his love, but when she suggested taking a job he was indignant. When she went shopping, someone from the firm was always with her. She had her own car, the smart red Triumph Reggie bought her when they became engaged, but she couldn't drive. She asked for driving lessons, but Reggie became jealous of the instructor. She stopped them before there was trouble. The car stayed outside in the street until the credit company reclaimed it. She lasted 8 weeks, Then she left. Those 8 weeks were all the married life they knew. Frances went back to her parents in Ormsby Street, but though she left her husband's roof, she could not get away from him, nor he from her. Each evening around 6 o'clock, he would put on a clean shirt and his best suit, have 2 stiff gins, and drive to Ormsby Street. The Shays would not allow their son-in-law in the house, so he would stand on the pavement. She would talk to him from the bedroom window, often for an hour or so. Apart from Frances, Reggie had one big problem on his mind that summer: how to provide a steady outlet for the stolen shares from North America. After the success of the first transaction, trade was booming, but there were technical problems which the twins could not hope to cope with on their own. The latest batch of $70,000 stolen Canadian government bonds needed forged registration certificates to make them negotiable. One of the twins' contacts spoke of a man to fix it. He was called Alan Cooper. Cooper was 36 and rich. He owned a private bank off Wigmore Street, several insurance companies, 2 Rollses, and a Yorkshire Terrier called Sam. Jewish, he had been brought up in England, served with the American Army, been imprisoned for a while in Germany, and traveled on an American passport. He was a mystery man. Some said he was a spy. It is known that at one time he ran a gold smuggling ring to the Far East, and later dabbled in arms deals. There are still endless rumors about him. One top detective from the Yard has taken a long interest in his career and says that he will almost certainly end with a bullet in his back. What has saved him so far has been his canniness and the unlikeliness of his appearance. He stands 5 feet 7 inches tall and has a sad moustache, sparse hair, and a faint stutter which gives his conversation a melancholy air. He never boasts, always appears defensive about his passion for good living, and says nothing of his flats in Brussels and Geneva and his big house on Camden Hill, nor of the many women in his life. Cooper was always on the move and used his bank as cover for his deals. He readily agreed to help the twins, and forged certificates for the stolen shares were soon concocted at the bank as an extra service. Cooper even offered to help the twins market them in Germany. He was quite sure it could be done and the proceedings be credited to London quite legitimately via the Hamburg branch of the Deutsche Bank. Within 10 days the twins would have their money. All Cooper wanted in return was their help as allies. Charles Richardson, the twins' old fellow prisoner from Shepton Mallet, was expanding his South London gang and starting to move into the West End. For some time he had fixed his eye on Cooper and his shady businesses and was becoming threatening. Cooper required protection. The twins were delighted to help, and so, through Cooper and their mafia connections in America, the twins were launched upon the path of international adventure. Backed by their name, the traffic in stolen North American securities flourished, with Cooper soon displacing Leslie Payne as organizer and go-between for the major deals. Through Cooper too, the twins began to meet a whole new clientele ready to profit by their services. Centered on Brussels was Europe's most elaborate forged currency syndicate. In northern Germany and Amsterdam, there was the ring that had virtually cornered the international market in stolen jewelry. Peace-loving Zurich was the center for international arms deals, Paris and the south of France for stolen major works of art, London and Geneva for gold smuggling. Then there were the drug runners and the spies. Each of these criminal trades had its acknowledged virtuosi and its leaders, who formed a sort of international underground of crime. These were the men Cooper knew, and here was a rich field for the twins. International crime is different from national crime only in quantity. There are the same feuds and jealousies, and every criminal specialist is vulnerable to one super specialist, the specialist in violence. That autumn Frances showed her first signs of a breakdown. A change would probably have cured her, but she had nowhere to go. Sometimes she was with Reggie, imagining that everything could still work out, sometimes with her parents saying the twins scared her. Most days she still saw Reggie. When she did, he tried to get her back. Sometimes she spent a day with him. In September, they drove to Dartmoor to visit Ronnie's friend, the Mad Axeman Frank Mitchell. She remembered him as a huge man with the biggest hands I ever saw, yet he was gentle, like a child. Reggie gave him a transistor radio. Mitchell had made Francis a present in the prison workshop, a small wooden jewel box lined with velvet. On days like these, it was easy to be happy. Back in London it was different. One night at Valence Road she had a row with Reggie which brought Ronnie down in his pajamas, bellowing at his brother to throw the fucking woman out for good. Frances began to sob hysterically. Her brother had to come and take her home. A few days later she was back with Reggie, but by now she was heavily on tranquilizers and pep pills. She suffered headaches and severe depressions. Like Ronnie, she began to fear the dark. Then in October she decided there was no hope for her marriage and told her mother that she wanted it annulled. Her mother swears that she was still a virgin. That same month a Cypriot waitress called Anna Zambadini brought a paternity suit against Reggie. It was dismissed, but the publicity helped counteract the slur of the threatened annulment. A few weeks later Frances entered the clinic of the Harley Street psychiatrist who was treating Ronnie. She had been married 6 months. That autumn, Ronnie started to compile his list again. Fame, money, foreign deals all had their uses, but he still felt threatened. The twins still had enemies. One was Mad Frankie Fraser. It was a good 9 years since this aggressive little man had taken sides with Billy Hill against the twins and gone to prison for his attack on Jack Spot. Now he was out, and Ronnie had heard rumors that he was friendly with another of the twins' old enemies, a fair-haired tearaway from Watney Street called Myers. There was resentment over a long firm of his that the twins had destroyed. Since meeting Fraser, he had changed his name to Cornell and moved south of the river, where they had both joined the Richardsons. By October, Cornell, Fraser, and both the Richardsons were down on Ronnie's list. Even today, there are criminals in London who puzzle over why the Krays and Richardsons ever had to clash. The criminal activities of the Richardsons seemed to begin at the opposite pole from those of the Krays. The twins were traditional Cockney villains, dangerous men who soon became the most powerful criminals in London. Charlie and Eddie Richardson were different. They were not Cockney villains, violent outsiders like the Krays. They were straightforward middle-class businessmen who turned to large-scale fraud to make their fortunes. They ran scrap metal yards and long firms south of the river, dabbled in government surplus, floated dubious companies. Eddie Richardson had a legitimate wholesale chemist's business bringing in at least £4,000 a year. Charlie had his office in Park Lane and his family house at Bromley. A year before, the twins would have dismissed the Richardsons as straight men. But as the gangs developed, they had shown marked similarities. There is a tendency for large-scale fraud to need the threat of violence in the background. By 1964, the Richardsons had started to enjoy it. After their arrest, it was the details of their gang brutality that caught the headlines: the mock courts in the Park Lane offices before the Richardsons, the pliers on the teeth and fingernails, and the electrode treatment for those who let them down. This did not worry Ronnie too much. What did disturb him was the threat of competition. He also heard that Cornell, himself one of the Richardson torturers, had called him that fat puff. Reggie urged caution. Ronnie wanted blood and was soon finding reasons to shed it. Fraser had taken over a chain of fruit machines that the twins had owned. Cornell had moved in on the West End pornography business. Just before Christmas 1965, Ronnie and the Richardsons met late one night at the Astor Club off Berkeley Square. Both sides were armed. Insults were uttered, and at one point it looked as if the shooting was about to start. A few weeks later, the twins were summoned to a meeting with two important visitors from the American Mafia. They spent 2 days together, talking as equals, and reached an understanding. The Americans were anxious to increase their stake in London gambling. Junkets, big organized gambling parties, would soon be flying in on a regular basis from California and New York. This meant big money on which the Americans were anxious to take their cut. In readiness, they were investing heavily in several new London gambling clubs and hotels. Millions of dollars were at stake. Nothing must go wrong. Provided the twins were ready to guarantee the new club's freedom from trouble, they would have their percentage. It was a nice nest egg to look forward to, but not if the Richardsons began throwing their weight about. From then on, all that counted was war against the Richardsons. No further business was accepted, no risks were taken. The firm was mobilized and the information service stepped up. Fresh arms were purchased, caches of arms and ammunition were established in different parts of London. Everybody on the firm was issued with an automatic. Ronnie wanted something more impressive for himself and Reggie. Through Alan Cooper, he bought 2 brand new Browning machine guns for £75 each. He also asked for Mills bombs and limpet mines. Cooper said these were not available. Ronnie enjoyed the Brownings, spending hours oiling them and studying the instruction manual. But weapons didn't make a war. He wanted allies too, and in January held a meeting at Fort Valence with the 2 other gangs who had most to lose from the rise of the Richardsons. From Clapham came 2 brothers who led a gang of thieves who had been closely involved in the Great Train robbery and had clashed with the Richardsons. From North London came 3 more brothers whose gang had long operated by courtesy of the twins. Ronnie was eloquent about the menace of the Richardsons. After they had drunk a lot, he began talking of his old dream of a federation of gangs. They should form a defensive alliance, a firm treaty that if one gang were attacked the others would come to its aid. And if someone's killed, it'd be up to the rest of us to do something about it. This seemed a good idea and they shook hands on it. The war began in February after a shouting match in the Stork Club between Ronnie and Fraser. The twins left Cedar Court. The colonel took command. The following few weeks were probably the happiest of his life. He was the guerrilla leader, armed to the teeth and ready for anything. Messages passed back and forth in code, meetings were summoned beneath forgotten bridges and in the backs of lorries. Spies brought in a flow of tidings of the enemy. Obscure East End pubs became the colonel's headquarters. Raids were planned and ambushes prepared. Reggie was with him, as he always was in time of trouble, the worries about Francis now forgotten, the humdrum business of the firm irrelevant. For once the twins appeared to have an enemy worth fighting. One night a raiding party shot up the Widow's pub in Tap Street from a car, 5 minutes after the twins had left. A few days later a car mounted the pavement in Valence Road, knocking down a man who looked like Ronnie. The twins put on bulletproof vests and started making preparations to use the machine guns against the Richardsons. Fate robbed them of the pleasure. An early morning fight broke out on the 8th of March, 1966 between 2 rival gangs at Mr. Smith's club on the London Eastbourne Road at Catford. A 30-year-old gangster called Richard Hart was killed. For once the twins were uninvolved. This was a Richardson job. For some time they had been infiltrating this drab segment of South London suburb. The night Hart was shot, Eddie Richardson and Frankie Fraser had arrived at the club soon after midnight, armed and ready for a showdown with the local gang protecting the place. It should have been a routine takeover. For once the local gang fought back, shooting it out over the blackjack tables. When the police arrived, Hart was already dead, Fraser was badly wounded and Eddie Richardson was having his gunshot wounds treated at Lewisham Hospital. Most of the top Richardson gangsters were involved. The police could move in now and it was clear that the Richardsons were finished. In one night at the Battle of Mr. Smith's club, the only gang that had tried to challenge the twins for control of London seemed to have destroyed itself. The twins had had their war won for them. This was the moment when they could have made themselves the richest criminals in Britain. Instead, Ronnie slipped a 9mm Mauser automatic into his shoulder holster and asked Scotch Jack Dixon to drive him to the blind beggar. It was a very casual death. Cornell was perched on a stool at the far end of the bar, drinking light ales with a couple of friends that night after Hart was killed. The pub was almost empty. It was 8:30 p.m. and the evening trade had barely started. a couple in the saloon bar near the door, an old man sipping Guinness in the public bar on the far side of the partition. The barmaid had just put a record on the jukebox to liven things up when Ronnie's arrival made this superfluous. Ian Barry was with him. Both had guns. "Well, just look who's here," said Cornell, and smiled. He had an unattractive smile. Instead of a reply, Barry fired 2 warning shots into the ceiling to send the barmaid scurrying for safety in the cellar. Then Ronnie shot Cornell through the head and walked back to the street where his car was waiting. When he had gone, the barmaid went to the wounded man, but there was little she could do. By the time Cornell reached the hospital, he was already dead. When the police arrived at the blind beggar, nobody had seen a thing. "I never like hurting anybody unless I feel it personally," Ronnie had always said. When he shot George Cornell, he was repaying him for several ancient insults as well as for calling him a fat puff behind his back. But there was more to it than that. Ronnie believed his honor as a leader was involved, for Hart was an ally. As one of the firm put it, one of ours had gone, so it was up to Ronnie to do one of theirs. It had to be Cornell. There was no one else left from the Richardsons' gang worth killing. Fraser was in hospital with a police guard by his bed. The Richardson brothers were in custody, along with everyone who had been at Mr. Smith's. Cornell was the one important member of their gang who was not involved, and so was the ideal victim. Thanks to his information service, Ronnie had known exactly where to find him. He had been trailing him for weeks. Ronnie Kray's shooting of George Cornell was soon the worst-kept secret in the East End. Ronnie had done what he had always dreamed of. He had killed openly as a gangster should. As he lay hiding in a small room over a barber's in the Lee Bridge Road, he lovingly recounted how it felt, the noise and the recoil of the gun, the look of blank surprise on Cornell's face, and how his head burst open as the bullet entered. Ronnie felt no remorse, no fear, only exhilaration. Reggie was taking care of things. Superintendent Butler, Scotland Yard's greatest detective, came down to Whitechapel to nail the murderer, but could not touch him. He knew who was guilty. The whole of Bethnal Green knew, but nobody would talk. Butler was putting all his hopes on the barmaid from the blind beggar, who must certainly have seen the killer if not the killing. He was too late. Someone had spoken to her. When Butler put Ronnie into an identity parade at Commercial Street Police Station, the woman nervously insisted that her memory was weak. So Butler of the Yard departed, leaving the Cornell killing as one of the few unsolved murders of his career. He also must have known that he was also leaving an entire area of London ruled by gang law.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.